Good afternoon. This past year, I have had the most curious sensation, a feeling that Mary Beaudry has been looking over my shoulder. This is nothing new to her former students, many of whom are participants in this session. But rather than a feeling of anxiety or terror because I was late with one or more dissertation chapters, or incompetence because my brain was working at a slower speed than hers, I have felt something different. A need to not only complete the projects we were working on, but to push myself beyond, to step out even, and experiment. I have been cooking with Mary for a very long time now, and if you will forgive the metaphors, I think it possible to develop some new cooking techniques and recipes, and perhaps even expand the menu. So let me outline some preliminary thoughts today that connect Mary's work in households, foodways, and assemblages of practice with my own research into cultural encounters, food, and identity. I want to begin with Mary's 2013 article in Northeast Historical Archaeology, Feasting on Broken Glass, Making a Meal of Seeds, Bones, and Sherds. Regarding her many years of fieldwork at the Spencer Pierce Little site in Newbury, Massachusetts, she commented that previously she had used a broad brush approach to evidence for food and dining. She had discussed food remains largely in isolation from the vessels and utensils used to consume them, and she had not truly addressed meal times and the experience of dining. In describing the artifacts of eating and dining associated with the various households at SPL, Mary urged us in this article to make the connection between the material culture of dining and its sensorial experience as a way to make people and objects active. Marcel Mauss used the term total social fact to argue that some practices, values, and norms transcend the individual, encapsulating, reflecting, but also informing larger elements of societal or cultural belief. As such, these practices, while they may be analyzed as separate functioning elements of a society or culture, when viewed together may reveal much about the larger culture or society. Arjun Appadurai argued that food is one of these total social facts, for an analysis of the meal can reveal information ranging from social and economic hierarchy to the construction and performance of identity, to the creation and fulfillment of obligations of family, community, religion, society, or culture. As Mary's thinking about food developed, she began to conceptualize meals, and particularly feasts, as total events. That is, social and cultural activities that involve the use of individual artifacts, but that taken together not only reveal the sensoriality of dining, but also the total social fact of the meal, from the shared conviviality of dining to networking, hierarchy, social obligation, and cultural belief. It is in this 2013 article that Mary first argued the value of considering entire suites of objects, whether cookery and dining, that is, all the remains and evidence associated with food preparation and consumption, or another activity such as smoking or personal care. Mary proposed the concept of assemblages of practice, saying that, quote, objects used together for habitual and or recurrent practices in combination create or recreate meaning, especially if objects are used together in culturally specific ways. In her co-authored paper with Conrad Ansack called Assemblages of Practice, a conceptual framework for exploring human-thing relations in archaeology, published in 2019, this concept is further explicated and its theoretical basis explored. The authors write, quote, to us, an assemblage of practice is a dynamic gathering of corresponding things entangled through situated daily and eventful human practice. The assemblage of practice becomes a powerful analytical tool that illuminates changes, continuities, and transformations in human thing entanglements, and not only their impacts on local and short-term socio-cultural developments, but also the repercussions on phenomena of much larger spatio-temporal scale, end quote. This is not just an effort to connect to the sensorial experience that is daily life, but an attempt to think of artifacts as, quote, vibrant things as opposed to static objects, end quote. Using the concept of assemblages of practice to restore agency to humans and possibly even to objects, and to consider or reconsider the relationships, the entanglements between people and things, which are active, fluid, and constantly in motion. What are the larger implications if we view assemblages of artifacts related to food as vibrant things in relation to household activities and daily experience, in terms of action and human agency within the household, the community, the broader culture? Let's use as an example the production, processing, and consumption of maize. We can identify some tools and utensils from the archaeological record and from probate inventories and other sources that relate to maize processing and consumption in the 17th and 18th centuries. Some items may be multi-purpose: Dutch ovens, spiders and griddles, ceramic vessels, utensils, a mortar and pestle. Others may be more specific. In association with macrobotanical remains, starch residues, and other archaeobotanical evidence, we can connect these multi-purpose vessels and utensils with a more specific use. The material culture of the kitchen becomes evidence of food production and processing for a specific dish or meal. Individually, that association might not be evident. Collectively, those remains indicate activities associated with the work of growing, processing, and preparing food, as well as its consumption. We can also begin to look at the meal system, from meal planning and budgeting to household chores, household hierarchy, who is performing the labor, for example, to what is considered appropriate to eat, how it should be eaten, when and with whom, to whether it is considered a poverty food or a staple, an everyday meal, or extraordinary food for a feast. This type of analysis is increasingly familiar, but where I am most interested in going and where I want to take you today is to a point where, using the evidence of foodways, we can look for alterations that reflect changing cultural attitudes towards new ingredients, new technologies, new ideas, or contact with new cultures. Does the specific evidence of processing or preparation or consumption reveal a mixing of ingredients or technology, substitution, creolization, or hybridization? Using food-related artifacts as an assemblage of practice, objects with a culturally meaningful connection, we need to consider changes in that assemblage. Do these changes reveal how identity is built, maintained, reinforced, or changed? We know that cultural encounters can lead to a range of outcomes in terms of food practices and food choices, including, but not limited to, creolization or mixing, and hybridization, that is, entirely new constructions, including new syntheses of ingredients and food practices. Innovation, imitation, and risk are identified as key factors in the transformation of food, as are adoption, adaptation, overlay, imposition, imitation, borrowing, and appropriation. We must also consider the possibility of acculturation and assimilation. Scholars continue to debate the value of both current and past models of culture contact and the limitations of such terms as acculturation and assimilation, even the language of culture contact. As we negotiate how best to think about the direction, degree, and outcomes of cultural change through encounter, assemblages of practice may aid in this conceptually. I follow Feyer and Ruffel in arguing that cultural encounters are a primary context for cultural change, and that as a result of encounter or repeated encounter, members of one culture or subculture may adopt some of the practices or values of another while retaining aspects of their own culture. Cultural transitions through contact and entanglement can be multi-directional, and there is no single outcome to such encounters. These changes can reflect acts of intentionality at the moment of encounter or long-term strategies. They can be voluntary or involuntary responses. So here is my question. Using the lens of food, can assemblages of practices not only restore activity and agency to humans, but capture the fluidity of cultural encounter and engagement, of identity that is negotiated and renegotiated? In Home Cooking in the Global Village, a study of Belizean foods and foodways, Richard Wilk identifies specific changes over time through encounters with new ingredients, processing, and cooking techniques and recipes. Using the metaphor of cooking, he argues that the processes of assembling, combining, recombining, and transforming foods and foodways in the course of cultural encounter and exchange can represent, encode, and even engender social and cultural processes of change. Multiple lines of evidence, oral, ethnographic, written, archaeological, architectural, material, and sensorial, can reveal the depth and complexity of these processes. Wilk identifies 6 categories or processes of change to foodways that can result from cultural encounter in the context of colonialism, imperialism, immigration, and globalization. These alterations may reflect involuntary reactions, acts of intentionality, and even long-term strategies in response to both internal and external pressures. But Wilk also suggests that identity is being negotiated and renegotiated here. The changes identified by Wilk are evidence of encounter, engagement, entanglement, not just in the context of colonizing and colonization, but also in the context of other kinds of population movements, immigration and migration, including voluntary and forced diaspora, as well as shifts in technology, economic production, and networking, expanding commodity chains associated with industrialization and globalization, even travel. Applied to archaeological assemblages, this approach to foodways can help us to untangle both localized actions and the broader impacts of globalization, colonization, and industrialization. If we think back to the specific changes in foodways described by Wilk, from the fusion of ingredients to changing technologies, processing methods, and even changing ideas of what is good to eat, these may reflect acculturation and assimilation, but also incorporation, making do, and accommodation, creativity in the kitchen, even acts of resistance in the face of cultural loss or threats to cultural identity, the persistence of local traditions, even a process of self-definition and the negotiation of individual and group identity. The discovery of maize residues in a native made clay cooking pot, like the one seen here, provides an example of how archaeologists might proceed. Analysis of the fragments, which were recovered from the original site of the English settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, revealed that the ceramic vessel was used to prepare a corn and meat stew, possibly using venison. As described by Roundtree and Turner in 2002, the remains of this and other native cooking vessels were found alongside evidence of English foods and European containers in James Fort, suggesting meals cooked by native women and exchanged, sold, or gifted to colonists within the fort. Combining data related to foodways, an assemblage that includes different artifact categories, plant and animal remains, architecture, space, historical and ethnographic sources, we might be able to use the remains of this one humble meal in conjunction with the evidence of other meals to assess the degree to which the presence of maize and the context of its use in James Fort represented a temporary response, making do, or the beginning of a more permanent shift in colonial foodways. The residues of maize and venison, the ceramic vessel fragments, are not just evidence of subsistence, but are associated in culturally meaningful ways. The location of the remains of a native prepared meal in a native made vessel with the remains of an English fort emphasizes that what is culturally meaningful is fluid, in motion, subject to pressures to change, even as it may persist or become something new. So the use of this concept of assemblages of practice in combination with foodways at the level of the household potentially allows us to recognize micro-level variation in cultural practice that is reflective or even constitutive of broader change. It helps us to better recognize and articulate the flow that is encounter, the shifting of identity, the complexity of cultural interaction, the nature of entanglement. These ideas are still nascent. Like mise en place, a French culinary term used to describe the assembling of ingredients and tools before beginning to prepare a dish, I've started to gather ideas from my research and writing, from course outlines and lecture notes. Whether the recipe will be a success is yet to be determined, but I have been cooking with Mary for a long time. I have learned from a master. Thank you very much.